Sometimes fate doesn't come like thunder. Sometimes it comes as a quiet knock, just 3 soft taps on a wooden door right when the sky forgets its color. That evening in the far corner of Esperanza Hollow, the wind carried the scent of snow before it fell. The cottonwoods had already shed their last leaves, and the air hummed with that strange stillness only the desert knows before winter arrived. Elias Boone had been mending the corral fence since morning. He wasn't a man who rushed anything, not his meals, not his thoughts, not his loneliness. The day was almost done when he heard it tap. Tap, tap. So gentle, he thought for a second it might have been the wind again. He set down his hammer, brushed the dust from his coat, and crossed the small yard. From the porch, he could see how the horizon had folded into dusk, turning the sand pink, then violet. The world felt suspended, like even the coyotes were holding their breath. And there they were, 2 children, barely tall enough to reach the door latch. A girl, maybe 6. A boy 3, silent and solemn, his small hand clutching the edge of her dress. The girl's cheeks were raw from the wind, but her chin lifted with quiet courage. In her arms, wrapped in a rough burlap shawl, something moved. A tuft of spotted fur, a glint of gold eyes. A young bobcat, maybe half-grown, breathing fast, ribs rising and falling beneath the cloth. The girl spoke first, her voice careful like a secret. "Mister, could you buy him? Mama's really sick. We don't have any money for the doctor." For a long breath, Elias just stood there. The last thing he expected out on that lonely stretch of land was a child trying to sell a wild creature for medicine. The boy didn't say a word. He only watched his thumb pressed tight against his palm. His eyes locked on the bundle as if the bobcat was the last piece of the world still safe to hold. Elias's voice came low. "You caught him?" The girl shook her head. "Found him by the riverbank. His paw was stuck in a trap. We pulled it free. Mama said to sell him so we could buy food." Elias stepped closer. Beneath the rough wrap, the bobcat stirred again, more frightened than fierce. Its paw was swollen fur matted with blood and dust. He looked back at the girl. Her eyes held that kind of steadiness children shouldn't need to learn so young. He opened the door. "Come in, all of you." The wind gave a small sigh of relief and the desert exhaled. Inside the adobe house, warmth met them like a quiet promise. The smell of coffee and pine resin drifted from the stove. The children hesitated near the threshold, the boy clutching his sister's dress, the girl clutching the bobcat. Elias nodded toward the fire. "Set him down easy, right there on the rug." She obeyed, careful, as if laying down something sacred. The bobcat blinked, hissed once out of habit, then lowered its head and closed its eyes. Elias crouched, studying the small creature, not tame, not wild anymore either. Somewhere between. He could see the mark of the trap on its paw. He could almost feel the pain radiating from it. He stood and went to the kitchen. The girl watched every movement, ready to snatch the animal up if he raised his voice or his hand. But he didn't. He returned with a basin of warm water, a roll of clean cloth, and a jar of salve that smelled of sage. "You've done good," he murmured. "Most folks would have left him." She didn't answer, just knelt beside him, mirroring his hands. They worked together, her holding him, cleaning the boy, pressing close enough to whisper a soundless prayer into the air. The bobcat flinched once, then went still. Outside, the wind carried faint howls from far-off coyotes, but inside there was only the sound of the crackling stove and a steady, shared breath. When they finished, Elias wrapped the paw and wiped his hands. "What's his name?" The girl looked puzzled. "Ain't got one yet. Then let's call him Rowan." Elias said softly, glancing at the little cat. "Strong even in the cold." Rowan. The name seemed to settle over the room like a blessing. Later, when the children ate the first warm food they'd likely had in days, thick bread dipped in milk. Elias leaned against the doorframe, watching. He noticed how they chewed slowly, almost reverently. How the girl would glance toward the bobcat every few bites as if to make sure he was still breathing. There was something unspoken between them. Loyalty born from hardship. That kind of love doesn't need many words. It just endures. Elias asked where their mama was. "Down the road in the wagon," the girl said. She got the fever. Been sleeping near 2 days. He nodded. The firelight caught the edge of his face, years of wear and the trace of something like worry, though he'd never call it that aloud. "We'll go to her," he said. "But first, you both warm up." When a man lives alone too long, he forgets how sound can fill a house, the scrape of spoons, the quiet hum of a lullaby, half remembered. Elias had built this place with his own hands years ago. Every board, every nail. He thought it was just a house. But that night, it began to feel like something more, a shelter big enough for a few souls who had nowhere else to stand. There's a strange kind of kindness that only shows up in empty places. It doesn't speak loudly. It doesn't need to. It simply opens a door when the world shuts every other one. And maybe that's what Elias did not, because he knew what would come next, but because a knock had reminded him what it meant to still have a heart that could answer. Before the children went to sleep, the girl Clara knelt beside the rug where Rowan lay curled. She stroked his fur carefully. "You think he'll be okay?" Elias nodded. "He'll heal. Might limp a while, but animals remember kindness longer than people do." The boy, Noah, was already asleep on the chair, small hands folded against his cheek. Outside, the wind rose again, not angry, just restless. It rattled the window pane like it wanted to come in too. Elias stoked the fire, then looked back at the small figures huddled near the warmth. He felt a tug somewhere beneath his ribs, something like recognition or maybe longing. He hadn't expected to feel that again, not since the day a certain woman had left this valley with promises she never kept. He closed his eyes for a moment. The fire cracked softly. Some stories, he thought, start not with a word, but with a silence that finally gets answered. There's a quiet kind of miracle in watching strangers share trust for the first time. Maybe you've seen it too in a lost animal that learns your touch won't hurt, or in a neighbor who finally lets you help. Those are small moments, but they carry the whole weight of what makes us human. Kindness isn't loud. It doesn't always look like rescue. Sometimes it's just an open door, a bowl of milk, a moment where the world stops asking why and simply says, "Stay." That night, Elias didn't know these children would change the rest of his life. He didn't know that the woman waiting sick in that wagon down by the arroyo was the same soul he'd once loved and lost. All he knew was that 3 soft knocks had found him before the cold could. And maybe that's enough to start a story worth telling, a story of love, loyalty, and the quiet courage it takes to care again. Out on the plains, the moon lifted itself over the ridgeline, pale and watchful. The bobcat stirred, testing its bandaged paw, and for a moment it looked straight at Elias as if it too recognized something in him. Maybe that's the secret of this life. Every wounded thing is just waiting for a safe place to rest. And sometimes the door you open for them is the same one that saves you. The next morning, when the frost had turned the sagebrush white, Elias walked with the children back toward the riverbed to the wagon where their mother lay. The air smelled of juniper and coming snow. He didn't know what he'd find. He only knew he had to go, because once you've opened your door to kindness, it keeps asking you to walk a little farther. If you've ever answered a quiet knock from a stray, a neighbor, or a memory, and it changed something in you, share that moment below. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories of love, loyalty, and the kind of kindness that keeps us human, stay with us. There's more to this tale than one night's firelight. Every road worth taking begins in silence. That morning, silence rode with them, Elias, Clara, and little Noah, as they walked toward the dry riverbed where the children said their wagon waited. The air was thin and bright, the kind of cold that burned the lungs before it blessed them. A thin frost still clung to the sagebrush, turning every leaf into glass. The sun hadn't yet climbed over the mesa, and their breaths came in small, visible prayers. Elias led the way, the children trailing behind Rowan the bobcat, padding silently at their heels. The bandaged paw brushed against the sand with a soft shuffle. It looked like the animal had decided without words, without need, that he belonged to them now. Every few steps, Clara would glance at him, half worried, half reassured. There was something in her small, steady gaze that made Elias's chest tighten, that quiet kind of loyalty you see in children and wild things. The kind that doesn't ask what comes next. When the heart remembers before the mind does, that's how fate announces itself. The path to the river wound between low junipers and sage. Dust lay frozen in the shadows, and the only sound was the soft scuff of boots and paws. Elias had walked that trail 1,000 times, years ago, back when the world still felt full of possibility. He knew the shape of the land by heart, the curve where the arroyo bent the split cottonwood that marked the old crossing. And yet, something about this morning made every turn feel strange, as if time itself were walking backward. When they reached the wagon, the world seemed to hold its breath. It was half hidden beneath a mesquite tree, the canvas flap-torn edges stiff with frost. A thin line of smoke rose from a small campfire that had long gone cold. Clara ran ahead, calling softly, "Mama!" The only answer was the rustle of the tarp. Elias followed slowly, his boots crunching the frozen sand. Inside he saw her. A woman lay curled beneath a blanket, her skin pale, her lips cracked, her breath shallow as thread. For a long second, Elias thought she was already gone. Then the faintest tremor moved through her chest. He stepped closer, and then the world shifted. Even after all those years, even with the fever's shadow dulling her features, he knew that face. Lydia Maynard. The name rose in him like a wave he'd spent 10 years trying to outswim. He knelt beside her, careful not to disturb the stillness. His hands hovered, unsure, how do you touch the past when it's come back as a ghost? Her hair was damp with sweat clinging to her temples. A small silver ring hung on a string around her neck, dull with age. Elias reached out, brushed the hair from her forehead, and saw the scar near her brow, a faint crescent, just as he remembered. The sight stole the air from his lungs. Mama Clara's voice broke the moment. Elias turned toward the children. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady. "She's alive, but we've got to move her now." He lifted Lydia in his arms, lighter than he expected, the weight of someone who's been running too long. She murmured something half-formed, a whisper from a fevered dream. It sounded like his name. The walk back to the adobe felt endless. The sun was climbing now, painting the sand in gold, but Elias barely noticed. Each step felt like stepping across years, across all the could-have-beens and didn't-happens that hung between them. Rowan trotted beside his boots, keeping close to Clara and Noah, as if he understood that the world had suddenly become fragile again. When they reached the house, Elias laid Lydia in his bed, the only real bed in the place, and covered her with a quilt stitched years ago by his mother's hands. He mixed willow bark and honey in warm water, whispering the old frontier remedy recipes his grandmother had once taught him. He wasn't sure if any of it would help, but sometimes care itself is a kind of medicine. The children sat by the fire, their small faces half lit by flame. Clara broke the silence. She was better last week. Then she started shaking. We stayed by the river because she said the sound helped her sleep. Her voice faltered. I tried to make her tea, but the matches got wet. Elias nodded slowly. You did right bringing her, and he meant it, though his heart was still somewhere between disbelief and ache. He glanced toward Lydia, her body small against the quilt. She looked both near and far at once, as if life itself hadn't yet decided which way to lean. There's a moment when you find someone you once loved standing at the edge of their own survival, that everything you thought you'd buried comes back. Anger, regret, tenderness you wish you didn't still feel. They all rise together like dust in sunlight, nothing you can hold, everything you can see. Elias sat by the hearth, elbows on his knees, watching the light move across the floor. He remembered the day she'd left, how he'd watched her wagon disappear down the same road he'd walked this morning. No explanation, no letter, just gone. He told himself for years he didn't care anymore. But when the fever took her breath shallow, he realized some wounds didn't scar the way others do. Some just stayed open quietly. Outside, the land stretched quietly and endlessly, the kind of landscape that taught people patience. In Esperanza, hollow kindness wasn't just a virtue. It was a survival skill. Folks didn't last out here without each other. Elias remembered stories of neighbors riding 15 miles in snow just to share a loaf of bread or help mend a roof before dawn. Maybe that's why his hands didn't shake when he tended Lydia's fever. Because somewhere deep down he knew helping her wasn't about forgiveness. It was about remembering what humanity sounds like when spoken softly. That night the fire burned low and the children finally slept. The bobcat lay curled near the hearth again. His breathing slow, his eyes half open, always watching. Once near midnight, Rowan stirred, ears twitching toward the door. Elias followed his gaze. Outside, the wind had changed direction, carrying a faint scent of rain. He thought of something his father used to say. When animals grow restless, the weather's about to tell you a truth. Maybe the storm coming wasn't just in the sky. Maybe it was everything he hadn't yet faced. By morning, Lydia's fever had broken slightly. Her breathing steadied. Clara sat beside her, humming a tune so quiet it almost disappeared into the crackle of fire. Elias brewed fresh tea and watched from the doorway. When Lydia stirred, she whispered something that made him freeze. "Tell him." I tried. He didn't ask what she meant. Some things needed to unfold in their own time, like the spring thaw after too long a winter. Outside, the first small drops of rain began to fall, dotting the dust like tiny mirrors. The scent of wet earth filled the room, rich and grounding. Every life carries a riverbed, a place where the water once ran clear before the drought came. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes decades, but the rain always finds its way back. Standing there, Elias realized maybe this was his rain. Maybe the past was giving him one more chance to let forgiveness soak through what bitterness had hardened. He didn't know if Lydia would wake again or if she'd remember him when she did. But he knew he couldn't turn away now. He placed another log on the fire, knelt beside the bed, and spoke quietly more to himself than to her. "Rest easy, Lydia. You're home now. You're safe." Rowan lifted his head at the sound of his voice, eyes reflecting the flame. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the desert, distant, not threatening. Just a reminder that the sky too remembers what it once held. That night, the rain came steadily, washing the dust from the windows. By dawn, Lydia's fever had eased, and the first light broke through the clouds like a whispered promise. The children were still asleep when Elias stepped outside. He looked toward the horizon, toward the town he hadn't visited in months, and knew what he had to do next. Before this storm of questions reached them, he needed answers. If this part of the story touched you, if you've ever stood beside someone from your past and felt both pain and grace in the same breath, leave a light in the comments below. Tell me, what do you believe can love, after all its miles, still find its way home? Stay with us for the next chapter. Sometimes the answers we look for wait just beyond the river bend. Some places remember you before you remember them, not by name, but by the sound of your footsteps, the warmth you leave in the floorboards, the air you breathe back into their walls. Elias Boone's house was like that, a small adobe heart set against a wide New Mexico sky, waiting all these years for laughter to return. That morning, after the rain light spilled through the windows in quiet ribbons, the smell of damp earth and coffee drifted through the single room. Lydia was still sleeping, her fever breaking inch by inch, but the children were awake, restless, hungry, curious. Rowan, the young bobcat, stretched near the hearth, his bandaged paw resting lightly against the rug. He'd survived another night, a small living proof that care once offered doesn't go to waste. A house doesn't become a home all at once. It learns you one kindness at a time. That was true here. In the space of 3 days, the quiet had changed its shape. Where once it felt heavy, it now felt full, like air after a hymn. Elias noticed it in small things first. The way Clara folded the blanket without being told. The way Noah laughed when Rowan chased a dust mote through the sunlight. Even the way the floor creaked under soft, unhurried steps, the sound of a place beginning to breathe again. Elias had lived alone long enough to forget what shared mornings felt like. He was used to silence that lasted days, to meals eaten standing up beside the stove. But that week, everything changed its rhythm. He rose early to make corn cakes and tea. The children helped Clara steady Noah, clumsy but proud. Together they filled the house with the simple noise of living dishes, clinking spoons, tapping little voices, humming. It was the first milestone of safety, the first meal no one hurried through. Later, while Lydia slept, Elias showed the children how to feed the chickens, how to scatter seed without wasting a grain. Clara followed carefully, Noah mostly chased shadows, and Rowan prowled the fence line like a small guardian. Each act, feeding, fixing, sweeping, became part of a quiet, home-making arc. The first night they all slept without fear. The first laugh that came without apology. The first chore done without being asked. 3 moments, 3 small proofs that hearts like houses can heal when tended gently. One afternoon, the wind carried the smell of rain again. Elias was mending the door hinge when he felt a tiny hand press a nail into his palm. Clara looked up at him and said Papa used to say a strong door keeps the bad weather out but lets the light in. He didn't answer right away. He just smiled, hammered the nail once, and watched her eyes. Sometimes children speak in borrowed memories, fragments of lives they're still learning to understand. Inside, Lydia stirred. Her fever had broken enough for her to stand. She moved slowly, wrapped in Elias's old flannel coat, tracing her fingers along the adobe wall as though greeting an old friend. For the first time, she looked around the room not as a patient, but as someone remembering she was alive. There's a holiness in ordinary sounds. Bread crust, cracking water, boiling wind at the window. They remind us that healing doesn't arrive like thunder. It comes quietly through repetition, through care that expects nothing in return. Elias had spent years believing peace was something you built from the outside, fences, roofs, routines. Now he saw it was something you built from within, one steady kindness at a time. He found himself talking more. Not about the past, not yet, but about the weather, the land, the habits that kept things alive. And the children listened wide-eyed, solemn, sometimes smiling, like they knew these lessons were a kind of love in disguise. In towns like Esperanza Hollow, people didn't survive alone. When the river dried, neighbors shared water. When someone fell sick, quilts traveled faster than rumors. There was a saying back then, kindness isn't charity, it's insurance. Elias remembered how years ago he and a few others had raised a barn for the widow down the hill. No one asked who would repay it. They just showed up. That's how frontier folks measured wealth in hands, not coins. He thought of that now as he watched Clara mend a tear in Noah's shirt using a bone needle too big for her fingers. Small acts, yet strong enough to hold a life together. Maybe that's what Lydia had been trying to give her children all along. The knowledge that love isn't a promise you say. It's a task you do daily, until it becomes who you are. At dusk, Lydia stepped outside for the first time since the fever. The sky was turning copper and violet. She stood on the porch, shawl pulled tight, breathing the cold air like it was her first full breath in years. Elias watched from inside but didn't follow. Some distances have to close on their own. She whispered a few words he couldn't hear, maybe a prayer, maybe a promise. Then she touched the door frame, tracing the grain of wood with her fingertips as if blessing it. Inside, the children had fallen asleep on the rug Rowan nestled between them. The fire painted soft gold on their faces. Lydia turned back, saw the glow through the window, and smiled a small, unsteady smile, but real. It was the second milestone, the first smile that believed in tomorrow. That night, the desert sang its low hymn wind through piñon coyotes, far off the faint rush of water returning to the arroyo. Every sound carried meaning. Rowan lifted his head, once eyes catching the light, as if he too felt the earth's heartbeat beneath the floor. In him the wilderness had found a home. In them the wilderness had found forgiveness. Sometimes nature preaches better than men ever could. The land doesn't demand we forget our pain. It simply keeps showing us how to outgrow it. A few days later, the first snow fell, light, hesitant melting as it touched the ground. Elias taught Clara how to catch snowflakes on her sleeve, how no two were alike. Noah squealed, Rowan darted, and for a brief, shining minute, the world felt brand new. Inside, Lydia laughed the softest sound, like a door finally opening. Elias looked up from the fire, and for the first time in a decade, his heart didn't ache when it beat. They were still poor, they were still uncertain, but they were together, and that was enough to start over. Maybe that's what makes this kind of story, these heartwarming stories of loss and return, so enduring. They remind us that even when life forgets your name, a house, a person, or a small creature might remember it for you. People often say happiness is loud, but those who've lived long enough know it's quieter than we think. It sounds like a match struck in early morning, or the hush right before someone says stay for supper. That's the kind of love that lasts. Not dramatic, Not perfect, just patient. And that's the third and truest milestone, belonging without needing to ask for it. As the snow melted and Lydia's strength returned, another sound approached, the slow beat of hooves down the road from town. The sheriff's horse, Elias, knew. Trouble travels politely out here, but it travels certain. By the time the dust settled, the peace they'd built inside those walls was about to be tested. If this moment of home finding its voice again reminded you of your own place of safety, tell us below. What small act once made your house feel alive? And if you'd like to keep walking with us through stories of kindness, loyalty, and the quiet power of love that rebuilds what time has broken, stay close. There's more warmth waiting in the next chapter. Sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't waking up. It's deciding that the world is still worth waking up to. Lydia Maynard opened her eyes on a morning painted gold. For a long while, she just listened to the crackle of fire, to the murmur of children whispering nearby, to the faint thud of an axe outside. She didn't know where she was yet, only that it was warm, and that she was still here. When she finally turned her head, the first thing she saw was Rowan, the young bobcat, stretched across the rug. His fur shimmered in the light, one paw bandaged his chest, rising slow and steady. For a second, she thought she must still be dreaming. Then she saw Clara kneeling beside him, brushing her tangled hair from her face, and everything rushed back, the fever, the wagon, the cold. "Mama," the little girl whispered. Lydia's throat ached, but she smiled. "I'm here, sweetheart." Her voice sounded smaller than she remembered, but it was hers again. When memory returns after a long silence, it doesn't knock. It whispers your name like someone you almost forgot to love. Lydia tried to sit up. Her body felt fragile, like glass warmed too quickly. The room was strange and familiar all at once. Adobe walls the color of dawn, a sturdy table, a man's coat hanging by the door. Through the window, she saw a figure splitting wood. The rhythm of the axe rose and fell like a heartbeat she used to know. It took her a full minute to believe it. Elias Boone, the man she'd left behind. The man she'd never stopped carrying inside her, even when she had no right to. When Elias came back inside, wiping the cold from his hands, their eyes met for the first time in 10 years. No words, just a stillness that filled the whole room. Lydia wanted to speak, but nothing came. The years stood between them like smoke. Elias poured water from the kettle, set a cup beside her. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "How long have I been?" "4 days," he answered. "You had a fever. The kids and that little cat brought you just in time." Rowan lifted his head as if to second the truth. Elias sat in the chair near her bed, the same chair where he'd waited through every long night of her fever. He didn't touch her hand, didn't ask questions. He just stayed. That was his kind of kindness, quiet, steady, patient as the weather. Lydia sipped the water. It burned a little going down. Then she looked toward the fire, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think I'd ever see this house again." "It remembers you," Elias said. "Maybe better than I do." Later that afternoon, while the children napped, Lydia tried to stand. Elias helped her to the porch. The air was crisp and the smell of pine carried down from the hills. She closed her eyes and let the sunlight rest on her face. For years, she'd lived behind closed curtains in borrowed houses with a husband who measured her silence more than her words. Now even the wind felt like forgiveness. She turned to Elias. "You must have wondered." He shook his head. "I stopped wondering. Didn't do any good. They made me marry him," she said softly. "My father. He said if I didn't, he'd ruin you. Said he had proof you forged the land papers. I knew it was a lie, but I couldn't prove it. I thought leaving would save you." Elias didn't move. Only his jaw tightened. She went on. "When the banker died, I thought I'd be free. But the men who handled his estate, they kept us trapped in different ways. I was never allowed to file for my own name. The children don't even have papers that claim them." Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, but not from fear, from release. The truth, once spoken, steadied her. Elias looked out toward the horizon where the last of the snow was melting off the fence. "You could have come to me. I didn't think I had the right." Silence fell again. Not cold, not sharp, just full. Lydia leaned back against the post, feeling her strength return little by little. Rowan jumped up beside her chair, curling around her feet. His loyalty was wordless pure. Forgiveness is a long road, and sometimes it starts before you even know you're walking it. For Lydia, it began the moment she stopped pretending she didn't still care. For Elias, it began the moment he realized that caring didn't need to sound like blame. They didn't speak much that evening. They didn't need to. Elias made stew, Lydia sliced the bread with trembling hands. The children watched, sensing the fragile peace between them, and Rowan purred low, like a bridge between two worlds, wild and tame, wounded and healing. The next day, Sheriff Halpern rode up the ridge. He was kind, one of those men who'd seen too much to bother with harshness. He brought news the banker's estate had filed a claim. They were sending an agent from Santa Fe to collect property belonging to the deceased. On paper, that meant Lydia's children. The sheriff leaned his weight on the porch rail. "Now, Elias, I don't hold with it," he said. "But law's a blunt tool. Says here she's got no standing, no marriage license in her name, no proof of identity. To keep them, she'll need a witness or a husband." The words fell heavy. Elias looked at Lydia, but she couldn't meet his eyes. "You've got a week," the sheriff added gently. "Train comes Sunday at noon." When he left, the wind filled the silence behind him. Lydia stood in the doorway long after the hoofbeats faded. The sunlight glinted off Rowan's eyes. Even the bobcat seemed to sense the weight of what had been said. "You can't lose them," Elias murmured. "I already have." "Once," she replied. "I won't again." That night she sat by the window, candlelight flickering on her face. She wrote her children's names carefully on scraps of paper, proof of something the law could never measure, love that never stopped working. Outside, the desert whispered its calm sermon. The stars had come out clear and sharp, and the air smelled of juniper smoke. The moonlight fell across Lydia's hands, across Rowan's fur, across Elias sitting near the fire, each figure half in light, half in shadow. "Funny thing about the desert," Elias said softly. "It never hides what's broken, but it never stops trying to bloom either." Lydia smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why I came back." And for a heartbeat they both laughed quietly, like people relearning the sound of grace. It was the first laugh they'd shared in a decade. Some stories don't end with triumph. They unfold like gentle morning's light stretching a little farther each day. This was one of those stories. A heartwarming story about how love, even after years of silence, can find a softer shape to live in. When Lydia finally slept, the candle burned low and the room felt lighter. Elias watched her from the chair, remembering the young woman who once dreamed aloud about painting the house blue. Now she was back, older, bruised, but brave enough to begin again. He thought of how much the world owed her, how much she still owed herself. He made a quiet vow, not spoken, but understood. Whatever came on that Sunday train, he wouldn't let her face it alone. By dawn, the air smelled of snow again. Elias saddled his horse, eyes fixed on the horizon where the train tracks cut across the valley. In 5 days, a stranger would arrive with papers and authority. But in 5 days, love might sign its own kind of document, one written not in ink, but in courage. And that's where we'll go next, to the day the law came riding, and a man's promise met its test. If this moment touched something in you, that space between pain and peace, share a light below. Have you ever forgiven someone without saying the words? Just by staying, your story might be the one that helps someone else heal tonight. And if you'd like to keep walking with us through stories of kindness, loyalty, and the quiet courage of love that learns to begin again, stay close. The next part waits just beyond the horizon. Some creatures don't speak our language, but they understand our silences better than we do. Rowan, the young bobcat they'd rescued, had become the still point in the turning world of that small adobe house. He moved through the days like a quiet promise, keeping watch when no one else could. It had been 4 days since the sheriff's visit. The news of the agent from Santa Fe hung over them like a far-off thundercloud. Elias felt it in the pit of his stomach each time the wind shifted from the south, the way animals sense a storm before it shows its face. Still, life went on in small ways, as if pretending normalcy might hold back the inevitable. Lydia mended clothes near the window, her stitches neat, her shoulders straight again. Clara read aloud from the old family Bible she could barely sound out. Noah built towers from firewood scraps. And Rowan watched them all, gold eyes, half-lidded body, coiled like a spring that never quite slept. When danger hides on the horizon, even the wild learn to listen deeper. Rowan had begun a new habit circling the yard before dusk. Every evening, just as the light turned copper, he'd leave the doorway, walk the perimeter of the small corral, pause at each fence post, then return to sit by the porch steps. No growl, no sign of aggression, only that alert stillness of a creature reading the air. At first, Elias thought it was instinct, the animal keeping claim on its space. But then one night, Rowan stopped mid-circle airs, twitching eyes fixed toward the ridge. Moments later, a gust of cold air swept through, the kind that comes before weather changes. By dawn, snow had returned. The storm lasted 2 days, blanketing Esperanza Hollow in white silence. During that time, they huddled inside fire burning steadily, soup simmering slow. The children traced patterns on the window frost. Elias sharpened tools that didn't need sharpening just to quiet his hands. And Rowan kept his vigil. He'd rise at odd hours, pad toward the door, stare into the dark as if measuring it. Sometimes he'd emit a low rumble, not fear, not threat, more like a warning shared with the wind. Lydia noticed first. He's listening to something, she said one night. Something we can't hear. Elias nodded. Maybe the land's telling him what's coming. It wasn't superstition. Out here, people trusted animal sense more than telegrams. They had to. The desert had its own weather reports, wings, tracks, silence. On the second evening of the storm, Lydia woke suddenly. Rowan was pacing near the hearth, tail flicking. Outside, the wind howled low, then cut off sharply. Elias went to the door. Down the valley, a light flickered, moving steady. He recognized it instantly, a lantern riding toward them. The sheriff. He arrived half an hour later, snow crusted on his coat. Agent's been delayed, he said, shaking off the cold. Tracks washed out down by the Pecos, but he'll come soon as they're clear. Maybe 2-3 days. Relief and dread tangled together in the room. Elias thanked him, poured coffee, but his mind was already turning. 3 days. Rowan lay back down, eyes half closed, as if satisfied that the message had been delivered. There are moments when life gives you an extension, not a gift, just time enough to decide what you'll do when the storm finally reaches you. That's where they were now. Waiting, hoping, pretending they could live normally for another few dawns. In those days, the house took on a kind of still grace. Every act became sacred, because it might be the last before everything changed. A loaf of bread baked slower. A laugh lingered longer. Even the bobcat's soft breathing by the fire felt like a lullaby to borrowed time. Lydia watched Elias, quietly noticing the lines that hadn't been there before. He'd grown leaner, more deliberate, a man who'd learned patience the hard way. She saw how he tended the animals, fixed the fences, and cared without asking to be thanked. "You never remarried," she said one afternoon. He shook his head. "Couldn't seem to find room in me for someone I wasn't missing." She looked down at her hands. "Maybe I shouldn't have come back." "Maybe you never left," he replied without looking up. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was healing. Out here, people believed animals carried messages not in magic, but in memory. Old Navajo stories said the bobcat walked between worlds, half shadow, half sunlight, the watcher who saw truth when humans looked away. He guards thresholds, Elias told the children one night as they fed Rowan scraps of meat. Between what and what, Clara asked. Between fear and courage, he said. Between the past and what we hope comes next. It was a small lesson wrapped in a bedtime story, part folklore, part fact. And it landed, because that's what Rowan had become for them, a living symbol of what survival looks like when it's still learning to trust. The moral story wasn't about taming a wild thing. It was about letting wildness teach you how to be whole again. The next night, as snow melted into mud, Rowan startled awake just before dawn. He bolted to the door, pawed once, then sat rigid, staring outward. Elias opened the door carefully. Far off across the valley came the distant whistle of a train. Sunday, Elias whispered. Already, Lydia asked behind him. Already. The agent would be on that train, the man with papers claiming what no ink should own. Elias closed the door, rested his forehead against it. Rowan pressed his body against the man's leg-tail, rapping gently, like reassurance. Animals don't make promises, but sometimes they keep them anyway. Loyalty isn't loud. It's a creature waiting by the door until the last lamp burns out, until the person it loves can rest. That's what Rowan taught them, that some forms of love don't ask for recognition. They just hold the line quietly. Elias had lost faith in many things, the law, luck, even prayer, but not in signs. And the bobcat's silent watch felt like one, don't run. Stand your ground. That night he told Lydia what he intended. If marrying me keeps them safe, I'll do it tomorrow morning, before that train stops. You'd bind yourself to me again after everything I waited 10 years, Lydia. I think I was already bound. She didn't answer with words. She reached out her hand, finding his. Rowan blinked slowly, the firelight reflecting gold in his eyes as if sealing the vow. The storm had cleared by morning. Dew glistened on the grass, and the first wildflowers had begun to rise from melted snow, tiny bursts of color against the gray. The land forgives, fast, Lydia said softly. Maybe it's smarter than we are, Elias replied. They saddled the horse, packed the wagon, and prepared for the ride into town. The children clutched Rowan's carrier, the bobcat, calm, as if he already knew his part in this story wasn't over. Before leaving, Elias looked back at the house. The windows caught the sun shining warm across the plain. For the first time in years, he felt something he almost didn't recognize. Hope. Every life holds a sentinel, something that watches over us when we can't. For some, it's faith. For others, it's family. And sometimes it's a small, half-wild creature who refuses to let darkness walk in alone. Rowan had been hurt, abandoned, and nearly lost to a steel trap. But healing made him a bridge between nature and man, between fear and trust, between the wild and the home that had learned his name. That's the miracle of love when it's done right. It doesn't tame. It teaches. It doesn't erase. It endures. And in that endurance lies the quiet happiness that lasts. As they set out toward a town, the sky cleared to a soft, impossible blue. The road stretched long and certain ahead, the train whistle echoing through the valley like a clock counting down. Rowan sat upright between the children, eyes fixed on the horizon. Whatever waited there, papers, judgment, or mercy, they would face it together. And that's where we'll go next, to the day when the law came calling, and courage had to speak louder than fear. If you've ever had an animal that seemed to sense what your heart couldn't say, share that memory below. What did it protect you from? What did it teach you about kindness or loyalty? Stories like yours remind us why we keep telling these soulful, heartwarming stories about love, courage, and the unseen guardians that walk beside us. Stay with us. The next chapter waits just down the tracks. In every small town, stories travel faster than trains. Sometimes they ride on truth, and sometimes on fear. But in Esperanza Hollow, they always arrive the same way as whispers carried on the wind. Elias Boone knew that wind well. He could feel it change before the first word ever reached his door. And on the morning they rode into town with Lydia and the children beside him, he could feel it again, that quiet stir that says something's already waiting to be said. Rowan, the young bobcat, sat calmly between the children in the wagon. His golden eyes reflected the passing light like twin embers. Even the horse seemed to move more softly, as if sensing the weight of what this trip meant. The sun had barely lifted when they reached Main Street. The church bell had just rung 9. A few shopkeepers looked up from sweeping their steps. A few didn't. By the time Elias tied the reins outside the general store, every window curtain seemed to flutter. When you come back from the edge of your own story, the world will always test whether you mean to stay. That's how it was that morning. No shouting, no stares, just the hush of curiosity disguised as politeness. Lydia stepped down from the wagon slowly. Clara held her mother's hand. Noah clutched the edge of her skirt. Rowan hopped down beside them, fur ruffling in the cool air. The children didn't notice the looks, but Lydia did, and so did Elias. He tipped his hat to the first man they passed, the blacksmith, but the man's nod was hesitant, his eyes darting toward Lydia like he was remembering a rumor. Inside the general store, the smell of flour and soap powder filled the air. The old pine floor creaked under their boots. Mrs. Whitaker stood behind the counter, a sturdy woman with silver hair and a heart that most folks forgot she had until it was needed. "Morning, Elias," she said evenly. "Morning," he replied. She looked at Lydia next. A pause. Then, "You look cold, dear. There's coffee in the pot." The sound of that kindness, plain and practical, broke something fragile in the silence. They filled their basket slowly. Flour, salt, candles, and cough syrup for the children. Elias kept glancing toward the door, listening for the train whistle that hadn't yet come. Lydia focused on keeping her hands from shaking. Behind them, two women whispered near the fabric bolts. "Did you hear? That's her, the banker's widow. I thought she'd left the territory. Came back, they say. With Boone." With Boone, Lydia heard every word, though she kept her eyes on the sugar sacks. Rowan crouched beneath the counter, gave a low rumble, not loud, just enough to hush the space. Mrs. Whitaker glanced at the women. "If you two have questions," she said mildly, "best ask them to someone who answers." The whispering stopped. Then she turned back to Lydia. "Take this." She slid a bag of flour across the counter. "On my bill." Lydia froze. "I can't." "You can," the woman interrupted. "You do the same." Elias exhaled slowly. It was the first breath that felt like air all morning. As they left the store, Lydia paused on the steps. Across the street, the sheriff stood talking with a tall man in a brown coat, the agent from Santa Fe. He carried a leather satchel and an expression made for ledgers, not lives. The sheriff saw them first. He tipped his hat, his eyes saying, "I'm sorry," before his mouth could. The agent turned, adjusting his coat. "Mrs. Maynard," he said, crisp as paper. "I've been sent on behalf of the late Charles Maynard's estate. I believe you have 2 dependents and certain effects belonging to his trust." The words hit like a cold gust. "They're my children," Lydia said quietly. "On record, they're unverified," he replied. "I'm here to take custody until proper guardianship is." Elias stepped forward. "You're not taking them anywhere." The street stilled. Rowan moved closer to the children's tail, flicking once a silent animal line drawn in the dust. The sheriff raised a hand. "Now let's all breathe." But it was clear to everyone the fight was no longer just about the law. It was about love and what belonged to whom. There are moments when the past and the present meet like 2 rivers, and you have to decide which one you'll stand in. For Lydia, that moment was now. She'd run from fear for years. She'd lived quiet, hidden, half alive. But this time, she didn't step back. "You can tell your office," she said, her voice steady, "that the papers never told the whole story. A piece of paper doesn't raise a child, or hold a fevered hand, or sing someone back from sleep." The agent blinked, unaccustomed to anyone answering back. Elias's hand rested on the wagon rail, calm but certain. And Rowan, silent, steady, sat like a guardian carved from living stone. It wasn't a battle fought in shouts. It was fought in person. In the way a mother stands, the way a man refuses to move, the way even a wild creature knows when a soul means home. From the doorway of the store, Mrs. Whitaker spoke up. "She's telling the truth," she said. "Those children have her eyes. And if you ask this town who's cared for them since they came, you'll hear one name, Boone." Then another voice, the blacksmith, gruff but sure. "He's right. Boone's been feeding half this town since the drought. Man's no liar." The whispers turned to murmurs. The sheriff crossed his arms. "Seems the town's spoken, Mr. Hale. Maybe best you write that in your report." The agent frowned, clearly unused to losing ground. "I'll require a signature," he said finally. "You'll have it," Elias replied, "before the day's out." And with that, the decision was made, one that would change all their lives. Sometimes, community doesn't roar. It simply refuses to stay quiet, and that kind of loyalty is worth more than any law. In that moment, Lydia understood something she hadn't for a long time, that home isn't just where you sleep. It's where people stand up for you when you're too tired to stand alone. The whispers had turned, as they often do in small towns, from judgment to defense. And somehow, that was the purest kind of kindness, the kind that expects nothing back. They rode home that afternoon with a lighter wagon and a heavier promise. Elias didn't say much. He didn't need to. The children slept against each other, Rowan curled at their feet, the rhythm of the wheels steady as a heartbeat. Lydia watched the horizon where the sunlight broke through the clouds. For the first time since returning, she smiled without fear of being seen. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage. Birds moved low across the plain. Even the earth seemed to sigh, as if the whole valley approved. "Funny," Elias said softly. "The same town that can bury you with talk can lift you with it too. Maybe people just needed to remember who they were." Lydia answered. He nodded. "Maybe we all did." And in that small exchange lay something bigger than victory. It was understanding. That every life, no matter how scarred, has a chance to be seen again in its best light. That evening, as the sun fell behind the ridge, Elias set a single lantern on the porch. Its glow reached out over the yard, over the corral, over the bobcat pacing the fence like a watchman of peace instead of peril. Tomorrow they'd ride to the courthouse to make it official, to sign a name not for ownership, but for belonging. And sometimes that's all love really asks, to be chosen in daylight. The story doesn't end here. Tomorrow brings vows, storms, and the kind of courage that only comes once the fear's been spent. If you've ever seen a community choose compassion over judgment, tell me about it below. What small act of loyalty restored your faith in people? These are the stories that keep this place and our hearts alive. And if you believe in kindness, loyalty, and the quiet strength of love that stands its ground, stay close. The next chapter arrives with the sound of a whistle on the wind. Some deadlines don't belong to clocks or calendars. They belong to the soul, to the moment you finally decide who you are and what you'll stand for. Sunday came bright and cold. The sky above Esperanza Hollow was a flawless blue, the kind that only appears after a hard storm, clean unburdened, too honest to hide behind. The train whistle echoed from miles away, faint but certain. By noon it would arrive in town, and with it the final answer papers to claim the children, or a promise to keep them. Elias Boone had never believed in fate, but that morning felt like one long-held breath waiting to be released. He'd been up since dawn, mending the wagon harness, heating water for coffee, setting out his cleanest shirt. Lydia watched quietly, hands folded in her lap, every small motion deliberate, like she was memorizing a life she didn't want to lose. Rowan, the young bobcat, paced near the porch steps, tail twitching, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He seemed to feel the weight of what day it was, as if nature itself had given him a job to do: keep watch until it was safe again. When love meets a deadline, every heartbeat starts to count like thunder. Inside, the children were still asleep. Their small breaths rose and fell in rhythm with the fire's crackle. The house smelled of wood smoke and bread, the scent of ordinary life that suddenly felt like a fragile miracle. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of Lydia. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, he said softly, "If the law wants papers, we'll give them papers." She looked up. "You mean?" He nodded once. "We'll go to the courthouse. Make it right. Not because we have to, because we choose to." It wasn't a grand declaration. It didn't need to be. It was love spoken in the language of loyalty. Simple, unadorned, real. By mid-morning, the wagon was ready. Lydia helped the children into clean clothes, her hands steady now. She'd spent too many years shaking from fear, from hunger, from uncertainty. Today, she was done shaking. Rowan jumped into the back, settling between the baskets. The sunlight caught his fur, turning it the color of wheat fields before harvest. As the wagon rolled down the hill toward town, the sound of wheels against dirt seemed to sync with their hearts, steady, deliberate, inevitable. At the crossing, they met Mrs. Whitaker standing near her gate, holding a small bouquet of sagebrush flowers. "For luck," she said, handing them to Lydia. "And because sometimes we all need a witness." Lydia smiled. You've done more than you know." "So have you," the woman replied. It was one of those heartwarming stories people don't notice while they're living it, kindness passing hand to hand like light through glass. When they reached town, the train was already visible, a silver line winding across the plain, smoke curling upward like a message to heaven. The clock tower struck 11:45. The sheriff stood on the steps of the courthouse, hat in hand. Beside him, the agent from Santa Fe clutched his satchel, face drawn tight as ledger lines. "You've cut it close," the agent said dryly. "Had chores?" Elias answered. Lydia stepped down the children behind her. Her posture was calm, not proud, not defiant, simply unafraid. Rowan followed, padding silently, his eyes scanning every movement. The clerk brought out a stack of papers, an ink bottle gleaming in the sun. "State requires the signatures," he said. "2 witnesses." Mrs. Whitaker and the sheriff stepped forward. The agent frowned. "You can't marry here without the preacher." "You're looking at him," the sheriff said gently. "Retired, but still licensed. I figure today's as holy a cause as any." A small ripple of laughter passed through the gathered townsfolk, the kind that breaks tension without erasing it. There's something sacred about an ordinary act done in extraordinary times. No church bells, no flowers. Just 2 people standing in daylight, choosing each other again. Elias took Lydia's hands. Her fingers trembled once, then steadied. The sheriff spoke softly. "No sermon, just truth. The law wants a name. The heart wants a home. You both already have that. This is just the paper that catches up." When the pen met the page, the train whistle blew in the distance, a deep, resonant sound rolling across the plain like thunder under sunlight. It was noon. Lydia's eyes filled not from sorrow, but from the relief of finally belonging somewhere again, in name, in spirit, in peace. Rowan gave a low, satisfied growl, almost like approval. Even the horse lifted its head, sensing the shift. Some promises don't need to be spoken. They just need to be signed with presence. That's what this moment was, not romance, not rescue, but reclamation. A moral story about 2 people who chose to rewrite their ending instead of running from it. The sheriff stamped the papers, handed the copy to the agent. "You can tell your folks in Santa Fe that Esperanza Hollow takes care of its own." The agent hesitated, then nodded. "I'll file it as settled." The townsfolk dispersed quietly, leaving the 4 of them and the bobcat standing in sunlight that now felt a little warmer. As the train pulled away, its smoke trailed like a ribbon across the sky. The sound faded into the wind until all that remained was the steady hush of the plains. "Feels strange," Lydia whispered, "like something heavy's been lifted, but I'm still learning how to stand without it." "That's how freedom feels at first," Elias said. Rowan rubbed against her leg, purring low. His once injured paw had healed almost completely. The desert wind carried the scent of rain and sage, brushing their faces like a benediction. "Look!" Clara pointed snowmelt in the arroyo. Down below, water trickled where dry sand had been the first flow since autumn. Elias smiled faintly. "The land remembers. Just needed time to heal." So did they all. In the years that followed, folks in Esperanza Hollow told the story, often how a widow and a rancher turned paperwork into a new beginning. They'd add details, as small towns do, that a bobcat sat as a witness, that the sheriff used his last drop of ink to make it official, that the train left without taking anything that mattered. It became one of those inspirational stories parents whispered to children when life got hard. A reminder that kindness can rewrite even the roughest drafts of fate. And though no one said it aloud, everyone felt it. The moment the pen met the page, the hollow itself seemed to breathe easier. Sometimes happiness doesn't shout. It hums quietly under your ribs, asking for nothing more than to keep going. That evening, they returned home as the sun dipped low. Lydia cooked supper while the children played by the fire. Elias stepped outside to close the gate, pausing to watch the sky fade from gold to indigo. Rowan sat beside him, tail-flicking eyes glowing faint in the dusk. "We made it, boy," Elias said softly. "Didn't think we would, but we did." The bobcat blinked slowly, as if agreeing that sometimes survival itself is enough of a victory. Later that night, Lydia stepped out onto the porch. Snow had begun to fall again, gentle this time, not a threat, just a reminder that seasons keep their promises too. Inside, the children were already asleep. Elias tended the fire. Rowan curled near the door, guarding the threshold. Tomorrow they'd wake to a clean white world, the kind that asks you to start fresh. But not all endings are quiet, and sometimes peace arrives only after one last storm. If you've ever faced a moment where you had to stand firm not for pride but for love, tell us below. What gave you courage when the deadline came? Your story might help someone else find their strength when it matters most. And if this chapter reminded you that loyalty, love, and quiet courage still hold power in our world, stay with us. The last chapter brings the stillness we've all been waiting for. Some endings don't arrive with applause. They arrive in quiet, in the sound of someone breathing peacefully beside you in a house that no longer echoes in the stillness that follows the storm. The morning after the wedding, the world outside had changed its color. Snow covered Esperanza Hollow in a thin white hush. The air was clean, the sky pale as porcelain, and the valley below shimmered like glass. The kind of winter morning that asks for no words, only gratitude. Elias woke first. He stirred the fire, listening to its soft rhythm, a sound that had become the heartbeat of the home. Beside the hearth, Rowan the bobcat lifted his head and stretched fur glowing in the light. His bandaged paw had long healed, but he still carried himself with that quiet grace of something half wild, half tamed by care. In another room, Lydia hummed low as she helped the children into their coats. They were planning to go outside and build their first snowman. Simple, ordinary, beautiful. It was the first day that felt completely their own. When peace finally comes, it doesn't ask for attention, it just asks to be noticed. That was the kind of peace filling the house now. Not loud, not dramatic, but true. It moved through each small act, the making of tea, the folding of blankets, the soft laughter that drifted through the doorway. Rowan followed the children to the yard paws, sinking gently into the snow. He circled them once, then sat nearby, golden eyes alert. The children's giggles rose into the cold air, warm enough to make the winter seem almost happy. Elias watched from the porch, mug in hand. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Some joys are too complete for commentary. In the days that followed, life settled into rhythm again. Not the old rhythm that one was gone, but a new, quieter one. Mornings began with chores and laughter. Lydia baked bread, the children fetched water from the pump, and Elias repaired whatever needed fixing before spring. Rowan kept watch at the edge of the yard, the silent guardian of this little world they'd built. At night, the wind sometimes whistled down from the mountains, carrying the memory of hardship. But inside, the fire glowed steady, and no one was afraid anymore. This was what survival looked like when it finally exhaled. Not grand, not proud, just full of loyalty to life, to love, to each other. One evening near sunset, Lydia stepped outside alone. The horizon burned gold, the snow reflecting it in soft shades of rose. She carried a bowl of scraps and knelt near the barn where Rowan sometimes disappeared into the shadows. She placed the food down, then whispered, "You saved us, didn't you?" The bobcat blinked slowly, his breath visible in the fading light. He didn't move closer, but he didn't run either. For a moment, it felt like the entire desert paused to listen to the quiet gratitude between two creatures who'd both been hurt and healed by kindness. Inside, Elias watched from the window. He didn't interrupt. He knew that some conversations were better left between the wounded and the wild. Healing doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. It turns pain into memory, memory into wisdom, and wisdom into peace. That night, as Lydia came back in, she found the children asleep near the hearth again. Noah curled against Rowan's fur, Clara's hand resting lightly on the cat's back. The firelight flickered over their faces, soft and safe. Elias closed his book eyes, warm. "They trust him," Lydia said softly. "Maybe they see what we forget," he replied. "That wild doesn't mean dangerous. Sometimes it just means honest." Lydia smiled, the kind of smile that holds both joy and ache. "I used to think peace was something you find," she whispered. "Now I think it's something you build." He nodded, one small act at a time, and she knew he was right. Because love isn't a sudden blaze, it's a lamp you keep lit night after night until it becomes its own sunrise. Weeks passed, and the story of what happened, the wedding, the papers, the courage it took, spread quietly through the valley. Some folks told it like a tale of luck, others called it fate. But the truth was simpler. It was just two people choosing hope over pride day after day, until hope became habit. That's the kind of story this was. Not a fairy tale, not a legend, but something more soulful. The type of story you tell when you need to remember that goodness is still possible even when the world seems colder than it should be. Elias often said later, "The hardest thing I ever did wasn't forgiving what happened. I believed I could still deserve peace after it." And that's the quiet truth of it. Peace isn't something you earn by perfection. It's something you're offered when you finally stop running from what hurt you. Spring came early that year. The river thawed, and the air smelled of mesquite and wet soil. Green shoots pushed through cracks in the earth. Rowan, now fully grown, began venturing farther from the house. Sometimes he'd disappear for a day or two, returning with pine needles in his fur or the faint scent of rain. Each time the children would run to meet him, calling his name with laughter that echoed across the plain. It was their ritual, a living rhythm of loyalty and return. One afternoon when the sun was high, Elias watched Rowan climb the ridge behind the house. The animal paused at the crest, turned once to look back, and then slipped into the wild beyond the trees. Lydia joined him on the porch. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked. "Maybe," Elias said. "Maybe not, but I think he knows the way." "So do we," she whispered. And in that exchange, just a handful of words, was the whole truth of their story. You can leave what's safe and still find your way home. In the end, what matters isn't how much you lost, but how much you dared to keep loving anyway. It's the small acts that save us. The bread baked for someone hungry. The hand that steadies a frightened child. The door left open for something wild and hurting to come in from the cold. This story began with a knock at dusk when two children stood on a stranger's porch holding a wounded creature. It ends here with warmth, laughter, and the sound of a healed bobcat running free. But maybe the truth is, it never really ends, because every time you open your door to kindness, another story begins in your town, your home, your heart. The world is full of unseen watchers, animals, neighbors, quiet souls who guard without asking for thanks. They remind us that love isn't a grand performance. It's the daily work of care, patience, and loyalty that makes a house into a home into a sanctuary, and a sanctuary into hope. When the wind passed over the hollow that evening, it sounded almost like a hymn. A low, steady hum that wove through the branches, through the adobe walls, through the hearts of those inside. And maybe that's what happiness really is. Not perfection, not applause, just the stillness after the storm when you finally know you're safe to rest. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own journey toward healing, or of a moment when kindness changed everything, take a breath right now. Hold it. Let it go. That's the sound of life continuing. That's your stillness after the storm. Tell us in the comments, what does home mean to you today? Have you ever opened your door to something wild? A stray, a neighbor, a memory, and found it changed you for the better? If this story brought you a little peace, a little faith in love and goodness, we'd be honored if you'd like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep sharing these soulful, heartwarming stories of courage, compassion, and connection. And if you'd like to go one step further, if you believe every wounded creature deserves a second chance, consider leaving a super thanks or donating through the link below. Every contribution helps rescue and heal wild animals like Rowan the bobcat, giving them the safety and care they deserve. From all of us here, thank you for being part of this community of quiet hearts. People who still believe in kindness, loyalty, and the gentle power of love that never gives up. Until next time, may your home stay warm, your heart stay open, and your story keep finding its way toward the light.